Our guest speaker is Dr. Jessica Nina Lester. She is an assistant professor of inquiry methodology in the Department of Counseling and Educational Psychology in the School of Education at Indiana University. She teaches qualitative research methods courses and also focuses much of her research on the study and development of qualitative methodologies. She situates much of her research within discourse studies and disability studies, with a particular focus on education and mental health context. So welcome, Dr. Jessica Lester.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to share with all of you. When I was invited to share, I was invited to talk about anything that I want to talk about related to qualitative methodology, with the hint of talking a little bit about something related to discourse analysis. So I'm attempting to respond to the request. So some of the things that I've shared, those of you that I've had in class, this will be a repeat. Some small pieces of it, where you can add in to things that perhaps I missed over, or gaps in my sharing. Okay? So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit first about the theoretical and methodological perspectives that I bring to my work, and that allow me to take the lens where I orient to language as something that I can study and make sense of as being something in use. I'm going to offer one empirical, really brief, just a really small snapshot of an empirical example from a medical field to illustrate some of the ways in which this shapes more applied understandings of applying these ideas. And we'll talk a little bit about the broader theoretical implications, and then I'm hoping that there's plenty of time for questions. So I wasn't told if there is a timekeeper, so is there a timekeeper? Okay, so you'll let me know about 5 minutes? Okay, great, thank you. So first, I'm going to start a bit around my positionality. So as I know that, as many of you know, a really important aspect of any qualitative endeavor is to spend time again and again unpacking our subjectivities and returning to them again and again as we engage with theory, as we engage with methodology, as we engage with data. So for me, a really important place that I come back to is my entry points. How did I come to this work? How did I come to this understanding of language? And how does it shape my next steps? So first off, early on, some of my early interests were really around the notion of incompetence as well as competence, and these binaries that are often set up around abnormality, normality, as Foucault and some of his mentors wrote extensively about. But I was particularly interested in the ways in which these are performed in everyday interactions. Places that are often cast as mundane, unexpected places where, in fact, able-bodiedness is being performed in particular ways, notions of you being someone who knows something or doesn't know something seems to be implicitly at work within the space. And so for me, I was particularly interested in these kinds of spaces, these kinds of interactions, both embodied interactions, verbal interactions. So that led me to begin exploring what was often described by participants in some of my qualitative work as the look of able-bodiedness, this notion that we often navigate the world and there's a performance that's given around ideas related to abnormality or normality. I was also particularly troubled, interested in, wanted to do something with this really sedimented notion that conceptions of intelligence are first and foremost ahistorical, meaning that there's this assumption that they've always existed, that there's no need to theorize or even critique the lack of theory around conceptions of intelligence. It wasn't a historical event. But we look over time that this notion, this construct of intelligence, has been tightly connected with verbalness. So the more verbal you are in a particular way, supposedly the more intelligent you are. And that became a really troubling concept for me, and one that I hope that I could make sense of empirically, and also begin to chip away at. Begin to show that competence is performed in varying ways, ways of being is performed in varying ways of knowing are performed in varying ways. And so that was of real interest to me. And alongside that, I was also particularly interested in, still am committed to, thinking about disability, first off from a critical perspective, but also taking up an intersectional lens. So if you're not familiar already, Goodley is a UK scholar who's written quite a bit about the importance of orienting to disability from an intersectional lens, and his work has really informed some of my ideas. I'm actually going to read this quote because I think it will shape for you the positionalities that I bring to my work. So he notes, foregrounding disability offers us a platform or plateau through which to think through, act, resist, relate, communicate, engage with one another against the hybridized forms of oppression and discrimination that so often do not speak singularly of disability. And so for me, his work has really shaped the way that I engage across literatures. So for instance, if I'm engaging with education literature, one of the things that I often ask myself is what identities are foregrounded, what identities are backgrounded, what are the consequences of this? That in itself is produced through language. So across all of this, over time, I began to articulate that for me, I was really aligned with this notion that it is through and in language that social realities are produced. And that certainly had implications for how I went about conceptualizing, empirically studying identities, empirically studying the notion of knowledge, the notion of knowing, of being. So across my work, the lenses that I bring to my work, my background is in cultural studies as well as qualitative methodology, so that literature base is one that certainly shapes the way I make sense of the world. And in addition to that, discourse theories, broadly defined, we'll talk a little bit about just a couple of them, that's a vast field, is certainly informing. And then substantively, most of my work sits at the intersections of critical disability studies and discourse studies, which we won't talk much about today. So I use that as a foreground. I think it's always important that we make components of our subjectivities explicit to make clear why we come to the work the way we do. Okay, so I'm going to lay a little bit of a foundation related to the theoretical and methodological perspectives that shape and can inform a notion of studying language and use. So first off, I think it's helpful if we just establish some similarity in regards to the language that's being used. So first off, language-based methodologies is an umbrella term that is often used to capture across a variety of perspectives and methodologies those approaches that are studying language. That includes things like the broad umbrella term of discourse analysis. It also includes other approaches. So that's an overarching methodology. Within it, you will also find some quantitative orientations to the study of language. So if we carve out one of those branches within language-based methodologies, discourse analysis is a vast landscape that includes within it, and I know as many of you that are literacy scholars and language education scholars, this is certainly your domain. It's certainly part of your home. But when we think about discourse analysis, one thing that can often be really overwhelming is how diverse it is. There's a lot of intersecting perspectives, and there's a lot of distinctions at the level of epistemology and ontology that distinguish people's work and commitments. And of course, there's also a great deal of overlap and willingness to engage across perspectives. If we think about DA, we can conceptualize it as an umbrella term that encompasses within it a variety of qualitative methodologies to the study of talk defined broadly, so embodiment is included within that, as well as text, materials for some researchers is also really central. This particular set of approaches is positioned more broadly within the domain of qualitative inquiry, and across approaches they tend to bring with them a commitment to social constructionism, some orientation to critical theories, and that's also a vast field, and that varies. And then also a long-standing commitment to taking up post-structural claims. So those are the theoretical underbelly, so to speak, that across approaches discourse analysts bring. And so we know across perspectives, we can think about things like critical discourse analysis, which brings with it lots of variation itself. We can also think about Foucauldian discourse analysis, Bakhtinian discourse analysis, sociolinguistic discourse analysis, and I could continue my list. In true academic form, right? We always invent something new. Then we can be cited, we can make a name for ourselves, and we have our own little production. So discourse analysis as a field has been heavily critiqued for falling into the trap of creating a productive model where more and more perspectives are being produced and perhaps not fruitfully. Nonetheless, what it offers us is an understanding of language as not neutral, but an understanding of language as something that produces something. So language as performative, language as action-based. In my micro-language, the assumption is that when I say something, such as, would you like to come with me? My very invitation is doing something. It's doing an invitation. There's a performative quality to the language itself. So that's an underlying assumption. So within this vast domain, in much of my own work, I draw upon one particular perspective that is referred to as discursive psychology. And as I've had conversations with several of you in the room regarding this, this is an unfortunate name because it brings with it the assumption that this is about psychology, and it's not. It's offering a critique of psychology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about it, not an extensive bit about it, just a little bit, enough so that we can conceptualize the meaning of language and use. So discursive psychology arose out of a critique of psychologized understandings of identity, individuality, psychologized understandings of emotions, and I can make an entire list of all of the different constructs that we are particularly focused on as education researchers that have been psychologized. And social psychologists that were engaged in this debate offered a critique that these constructs were constructs that were produced in and through language. They were not neutral entities. They did not just exist. They were not ahistorical. They were produced at particular moments. They were situated, they were occasioned, and they are bound within language themselves. So what that did for the study of identity, for instance, rather than orienting to it in the traditional psychological way, which assumes that identity resides within you, that it is something that you can tell us about, and it is singular, it is not negotiated, it repositioned identity as something that is socially constructed, reconstructed, 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 ascribed, resisted, and so on and so on. So obviously, those that engage in this debate are no longer considered social psychologists. What happens when you do this is you're typically pushed out of your field. And so they position themselves as social scientists who engage in the study of language and have particularly focused on the idea that these historically psychologized ideas can be reframed as being produced in and through language. Okay? And so that was in the late 70s. And as a just kind of a historical marker, all of the ideas that inform discourse analysis, they're not new. Linguistic philosophers talked about them for a long time. But it became kind of a generation of methodological ideas in the late 70s and 80s. And most of that generation was happening within the European context. And all of the different proliferation of ideas, many of them occurred around the same table, meaning that people showed up for symposiums like this and had debates around ideas, and it led to different perspectives, different proliferations of ideas. So this was one of them. And what happened after this early critique of psychology is that the early developers, their names were Potter and Edwards, they begin to have interactions every Tuesday afternoon. This is like a true story. Every Tuesday afternoon, they had interactions across perspectives. So critical discourse scholars showed up, conversation analysts showed up, rhetorical scholars showed up, visual ethnographers showed up, and they debated their understanding of language. And what began to occur is they begin to draw upon each other's ideas. And so within discursive psychology, we see different strands of how the work is actualized. So some of the earliest work is typically characterized as a critical approach to discursive psychology. If you're familiar with the way that Foucault's work has been translated into Foucauldian discourse analysis, it's actually quite similar. It draws upon similar ideas related to subject positions. One of the claims that they make is focusing both on the micro-interactional components while also attending to the social, more macro conditions. So you'll see lots of overlap with some of the claims of critical discourse analysis as well. And then the most dominant strand within DP was one that was heavily informed by ethnomethodology from the field of sociology as well as conversation analysis. And we're going to talk a little bit about those particular perspectives, and I'll highlight for you how those perspectives bring us this notion of language and use, the value of studying language and use. Okay, so conversation analysis is an American methodological perspective. So within American sociology, so I like methodological gossip if you haven't had me in class. And my version of gossip is just people's stories about how they came to these ideas. So here's how this idea became to be. There were some grad students who were sociology students at Berkeley. And they were taking courses with Garfinkel and Goffman. And when they took these courses in American sociology, the standard perspective on how you study the world was that you apply really broad, already pre-established theories to people and explain their behaviors through quantitative approaches. So the theoretical ideas were already pre-established. They were designed to explain everyday life without studying everyday life. Garfinkel and Goffman, who collaborated on some of these ideas, argued that, you know what we should really be doing? We should actually be observing people. If we're interested in how people live their lives, it seems obvious to us in this room, but it was really radical. They suggested, let's go observe people. That was incredibly radical in the American sociology community, and something that you did not see in a conference. And so they were the teachers of 2 grad students who were really taken with these ideas and began to conceptualize the possibility of, if I want to understand what people are doing, I need to observe them. So fast forward to their dissertation work, wherein they were given access to a data set at UCLA, wherein people were calling into a suicide hotline and asking for help. And one of the grad students, named Harvey Sachs, was asked to help them make sense of how to analyze this data. Hundreds and hundreds of hours of people calling in asking for help. And that became the focus of his dissertation as well as his postdoc. And through that, he began to closely study conversation. And out of that study emerged what is called conversation analysis. So its home was really at UCLA. And what he was arguing for in this qualitative orientation was the idea that we can study social interaction by attending to the details of talk in interaction. And he was particularly interested in the sequentiality of talk. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the overarching claim that he was making was that we as social actors make sense of the world, make sense of an occasion situated everyday happening in our responses to one another. And that we could understand how the world is organized by studying language as it is being used. So historically then, conversation analysts have been interested in mundane conversations, so conversations that happen in everyday happenings that aren't bound within institutional spaces like this space. And then around the 70s, there became an interest in what's called institutional talk, so educational classrooms, but particularly they were interested in courtroom interactions, and it has emerged since. So they're really interested in this notion of interactional organization of everyday institutional social activities. So these particular perspectives are perspectives that have heavily shaped discursive psychology, one approach to discourse analysis. And so here is a really seminal turn that occurred within American sociology that has heavily influenced not just conversation analysis, but you can see it across several strands of discourse analysis. So Sachs offered this. This is one of my favorite claims. If we are to understand and analyze participants' own concepts and accounts, then we have to find and analyze them not in response to our research questions, but in the places they ordinarily and functionally occur, and the activities in which they are employed. So this is a methodological call. It would shape how we would go about studying something. So rather than asking people how they talk about something or think about something, Sachs suggested that we should study them in action. We should study their language in action, study their language in use. And so language in use, talk, and interaction is a turn of phrase that has historically been used to mark that recognition, to mark that commitment, that if you want to study how people perform life, how identities are negotiated, how identities are ascribed, how they're resisted, how we do resistance, watch people using their language, study things in use. So the assumption here is that language is meaningful in its use. And when we study language and use, we can make sense of its use by attending to the sequentiality of the talk. So turn by turn interactions can be studied. Turn taking, the structure itself can help us understand everyday social order. Okay? Okay, so we're going to move historically forward about 10 years. So there became a rabid, still is, a really high interest in how can we apply these ideas to institutional spaces. Spaces where people often bring really critical questions. So for instance, in an education space, someone might have questions around changing their practice. In a medical space, someone might have questions around changing their practice. Understanding that, even if they just call it practice, understanding that the way we do our practice is through language. Therefore, if we change our language, isn't there a potential to change practice? So how could we as researchers support people in changing this practice? So what this has led to is what's called traditionally applied conversational analysis. So when you think about CA, conversational analysis, you can think about kind of two different versions. They're built on the same assumptions about language. CA, or pure CA, has historically focused on studying Monday conversations, like conversations that would be happening as people walk down the sidewalk on their way to coffee. Applied CA is the application of the CA concepts and analytic principles to study talk that occurs in institutional contexts, like a classroom, like a pediatric clinic, something like that. Okay? So I'm going to give you an example of the potential for studying an applied context and drawing upon the principles of both discursive psychology and conversational analysis. And before I do that, I just want to mention that if you're interested in this notion of applied conversational analysis, particularly for those of you that might be interested in the idea of thinking about how you can translate a methodological approach to impacting practice, Charles Antaki has written actually the only book that has brought together key ideas related to the implications of taking an applied approach. And these are the implications that he offers. So different projects might focus around re-specifying a discipline. So discursive psychology aims to re-specify social psychology. Social problem-oriented, so moving from the micro to the macro. So the critical discursive psychology work has really focused on attending to both micro, macro, and moving back and forth. Some applied work has fundamentally supported people in understanding the idea that language problems are perhaps not problems, and perhaps we need to be more expansive in our understanding of how language might be performed in varying ways. So institutional focus, so the study of particular institutions like a school or a clinic. And then there's a growing body of applied conversation analysts who have focused on intervening, so interventionist approaches. So with the intent of eventually interacting with the practitioners in a space and feeding them information back, and specifically in relationship to how the sequentiality of their talk is shaping the social order or the social norms of the space in which they interact. And I'll give you a few examples of those. Okay, so I'm going to briefly, I think we only have like 5 minutes, so briefly give you an empirical example. We won't look at the data very much. So this particular data set, and I didn't mention at the beginning, so I don't substantively bound my work, so this work is outside of education. This is within a child mental health assessment context in the United Kingdom. So in the UK, if you have a desire to acquire further supports for your child who you believe might have a mental health concern, you have to go to an initial appointment wherein the physician determines whether what you share legitimizes their decision to send you to someone who can potentially diagnose your child. And so this particular data set is one wherein it was collected at a child mental health assessment, where children were being assessed for potential problems that would justify them being promoted to the next level of the health system. And so specifically, one of the analytic focal points of this work has been examining how parents, family members, sometimes grandparents come or siblings come, and children co-construct that there is a problem within the context of this mental health clinic There's been a lot of work on multi-party interactions, practitioner, parent, child kind of interactions. That brings with it a really interesting sequential nature to the talk itself. And then also in this particular context, it is high stakes. Parents must build a case that there is something wrong with their child if they want the physician to then refer them on. In this particular iteration of the work, my colleagues and I were particularly interested in the moments of disagreement, particularly when disagreement arose between a parent's account and the child's telling of what was occurring with them. So a little bit more about the data itself. So it was video recorded data. Unfortunately, I can't show you any of those clips for ethical reasons. About 42 hours of video recordings across 28 families. And the professionals that were involved in these assessments included psychiatrists as well as clinical psychologists, nurses, and medical students. And I will say that the psychiatrists were part of the research team. So they are really interested in thinking about how their practices can be better understood through the lens of an applied CA kind of perspective. Okay, so just a few analytical highlights. So one of the things that we're particularly interested in is the positioning of the child in varying ways, be it their mind, their body, or a combination, as being the problem, and the negotiation of problem making. So how is someone cast or not cast as a problem? And this is particularly important in the data. One thing that we note is that parents and family members are managing stake. There's a huge stake in positioning your child as having a problem. At the one moment, you need your child to be identified as having something that provides them with access to the next level. At the next point, there's a risk that you potentially lose face, so to speak, in your positioning of yourself as opening the door to potentially being accused as being a bad parent. So these are the three areas that we began to unpack across the data. How are children positioned was the problem? How did parents and family members manage the stake involved of positioning their child as problematic? And how are threats to face or being a good parent, how are they negotiated and managed, particularly by parents when there is a disagreement in the interaction? Okay, so I'm not going to talk through the analytic approach. All I'm going to say is that across language-based perspectives, there's always a hesitation to make a linear outline of I did this, 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 and this. Mine does say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, recognizing that it is an incredibly cyclical, iterative, layered process. But I know as graduate students, this is the most common question I'm asked. What are the steps? And you typically hear from me, we'll get to that a lot later because it's not really steps. But I do think it's helpful for us to begin to think about what are some of the ways I can make sense of my data. And these are the ways that I did. And if you're interested, we can talk more about it later. So I'm just going to show a couple of extracts. And I will say in CA, conversation analysis, if you're not familiar, as also true of discursive psychology, the method of transcription that's used is the Jeffersonian method. So there's an interest in not just what is said, not just the content, but also how it's said. So you'll see some symbols here that highlight, for instance, the gap between one conversational turn and another. Also things that are whispered versus loud, things that are emphasized, intonations. So in this particular extract, the doctor says, Elliot, this is the child's pseudonym, why do you think you get kicked out of so many places? So a fairly long gap. So in Dutch and English interaction, a typical gap is between 0.9 and 1.3 seconds. So 1.65, it's not unexpected that rather than waiting longer, the doctor comes in and offers a filler. You're not sure, child says nah, doctor says okay. So here we see disagreement. The mom jumps in and said, he knows, he got anger issues. Do you think you got anger issues? Do I? Yeah. Child? No. Doctor? Okay. All right. So in this particular passage, we were particularly interested in how this disagreement between the child and the parent are negotiated, and how the child themselves becomes positioned as having anger issues, even with the resistance that's displayed there. So as another brief example, the grandma indicates that the child gets upset if things don't go as planned. I had a problem with my, she gives an example. The clinical psychologist offers with overlapping speech. If there's a kind of change of plans, yeah, and the child jumps in with overlapping speech, no I don't. So we see a direct disagreement here. And we don't just see a minimal disagreement, we see a continuation of that. No I don't, no I don't, no I don't, no, none of this is true. And true is emphasized. So an emphatic conclusion to the disagreement. The adult laughs, and the child offers, none of that is true. And the mom offers, and he's also incredibly embarrassing as well. And so here, we can say that the grandmother positions the child in a way that is problematic and promotes this notion of an outcome where a professional agrees here that a child has a problem. The child's emphatic in their denial of the subject positioning, we could say, how he's being positioned as a subject. But this is treated with laughter. And laughter is an important interactional move that's made here, with the very denial or disagreement of the child being managed by, in this case, being made light of. So the final example I'll show you here. So in this particular extract, we see here that the mom says, I took him to the police station, police spoke to him, fire came out. So here, I'm just going to talk a little bit about my interpretation of this one. So sequentially here, the mother's positioning the subject position of the child negatively, which implies a pathology. And the doctor accepts that claim and asks for the reason. So disagreement then ensues with the child when he says, or she, I didn't. And then following that, we see that the mother and the doctor seemingly discount the child's counterclaim. And here we can also see there has to be an explanation for the behavior. So behavior just can't be given. There's an explanation, and the implication is that the responsibility and the issue in this case lies with the child. So this is one way that we could make sense of how a parent manages their stake. Parental identity is at risk here, being a good parent. So implicitly you can build up through the construction of the child's negative identity construction a way to save face. Those are just small snippets. And now a small snippet of why a psychiatrist would care. So beyond the idea that parent identity is at stake, these particular institutional contexts are contexts wherein there's an agreed upon philosophy and claim that child-centered practices are being used. And what that means is the theoretical position of child-centered practice is that the child's knowledge base, their epistemics, are the ones that are privileged. So in theory, these clinics are set up in a way wherein the physicians are hoping that the child's knowledge of self drives the care. And so they're particularly interested in their conversational turns in relationship to the conversational turns of the other members of that interaction, and better understanding how they can create a more child-centered context. And so disagreements are obviously of particular relevance in that the disagreement often ensues between a mother or other family member's account and the child themselves. Okay, that's just one example. So just to conclude, returning to theory here. So the idea is, within those perspectives that really align with this notion of attending to language in use, is this idea that language in use can function to reframe and position everyday and institutional happenings as things that we can both explain, as well as things that are potentially problematic, and for those that take up applied lenses, things that are potentially solvable. We can offer some concrete suggestions for. In addition to that, across that particular perspective, there is an ongoing commitment and willingness to play analytically with the idea that attending to language as something that is used, so language in use, is one way to counter discourses that offer cultural critiques of pre-established models of how we do things, of pre-established understandings of practice. Okay, so questions, comments?
performances in ELF and so on right now. It was really interesting to hear your take on that.
Certainly sounds like it's spot on alignment.
I'm wondering whether the parents of children had a chance to talk about the transplant conversation with parents. I have to go. I know we're trading and helping them to observe their problem conversation.
Yeah, that would be ideal if all the interactants in an interaction could be part of critically making sense of the interaction itself. And in this particular project, only the clinicians are involved in being fed back the findings and the transcripts themselves.
This is an impossible question to answer, I think. And that is, I noticed you paid some attention to pauses in that instance. And I'm sort of interested in the science of pauses in this case. Now you talked about the I think it was the average pauses in, I think you said Dutch and English, was that it?
Yep.
How do you go about ascribing meaning to pauses in something like that transcript?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so fundamental across all micro details, be it pauses or emphasis, is you're looking at participant orientations. So for instance, the next speaker could have oriented to the pause as problematic by perhaps asking the question again and again and again and again and again. So what you're really looking at is what do the speakers do in response to that particular pause. In response
to the pause.
Mm-hmm.
So you're more interested in the response to the pause than the actual significance of the pause itself in assigning meaning to the utterance.
The assumption is that how interactants respond, meaning is being implied through the response itself. So as an example,
you're doing it now. Yeah.
So any
you had a
space
few pauses
as well.
Yeah. No, it wasn't a criticism, it's an observation. My question was much less coherent. Yeah.
So in some of my, I love silences. I love studying silences, pauses, gaps. So in some of my other work, the data is with therapists who are working with children who are nonverbal. And the data occurs in a waiting room where parents are waiting with the child who's nonverbal. And I'm particularly interested in the early introduction where the therapist comes up and goes, "Hi, how are you?" And what often happens is, "Hi, how are you?" results in about a 10 to 12 minute pause before any embodied response is given. And what typically occurs in this particular context is that pause is filled by the caretaker asking the question repetitively. "Tell them how you are, sweetie, tell them how you are. You know how you are. Come on, tell them how you are, tell them how you are." And what you'll see happen in an embodied way is that therapists get down on their knees. It's typical across the entire context. Therapist gets down on their knees and the interaction happens hand to hand, face to face. And it's a sign, essentially, that means I'm fine, but it usually takes about 10 seconds for the next turn to be get up and go to the therapy room. And so from a CA perspective, a conversation analysis perspective, the function of that pause, the meaning of the pause, how it functions in the social space is only understood in relationship to what happens next and thereon.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and so the pause, it seems to me, creates a meaning in that particular setting that it might not, say, here.
Right, so like to counter some of the research that is highlighted in some westernized English and in Dutch talk, an average of 1.9 to 1.3, 1.6 seconds. There's been a really great study in an Aboriginal community wherein the comfortable pause was understood to be about 13 seconds, which is radically different than that body of research. Also, Deborah Tannen has highlighted how in Yiddish New York communities, pauses are viewed as problematic generally because overlapping speech is the expected norm. That's the normative kind of expectation. Understood through, again, how are participants orienting to this presumed potential anomaly.
So So I'm wondering in terms of theory, because you said that this was much more, in a sense, data-driven. In other words, you know, emerging from the conversation itself rather than posing preconceived questions, research questions, or having some kind of a theoretical frame from which one would then be looking at all of this. How does theory then blend into this whole approach?
So when you say theory, you're referring to theories outside of theory's underlying methodology?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like a theoretical framework?
Right.
So in conversation analysis, and this is not untrue of many approaches of discourse analysis as well, there is the possibility of positioning your methodological lens as also your theoretical lens. And in CA, that's the norm. So underlying theories of that are things like speech-act theory, perspectives related to ethnomethodology, as well as some of the post-structural authors. So there's a theoretical base, and methodology then is positioned as both theory and method, which we see quite often also with like CDA, DP, Wachtinian discourse analysis. Does that mean that people don't often also draw upon other theoretical perspectives? Or like, for instance, if you want to do this work and also submit to AERA and their little thing says you have to have a theoretical perspective, what do? When I'm submitting work to those kinds of spaces, I spend a lot of time talking about how my methodological orientation brings with it theories, and here is what they are, and here is how they help me understand human interaction. If I feel there is a need to also draw upon something like communities of practice, there are certainly examples of people doing that. But it's certainly the idea of beginning to think about methodology as bringing theories with it, and playing with the idea of starting with theory as embedded within these assumptions.
I have a question. I can see that language and use perspective really challenges the our taking for granted assumptions about not only speech but also about participants or people who are, performing language. So I was wondering about if you're doing a micro-analysis of the speech, then how can you really draw upon culture, for example, or bigger pictures and how it's really interrelated to what is being performed in this speech. So I think it's very difficult even for me because I'm doing the same a DA. So it's like I don't know how can you really not ignore but just focus on one thing, not the other, or interconnect both of them.
Are you asking from a CA perspective or just generally in DA? How do you balance this micro approach against the broader macro social conditions? Yeah, so across DA perspectives and CA, scholars will approach that in different ways, from don't worry about it, ignore it, let's not have the conversation around context, because that is sticky. What is context? No one really knows, but it matters, but maybe it doesn't. So there are scholars that just say, let's just focus on the micro. But I would say across DA perspectives, particularly those perspectives that try to wrestle across approaches, there is an acknowledgement that number one, it is difficult to move between back and forth, to interact between the micro and the macro, particularly if you're claiming that the claims that you're making are substantiated through your micro, but you don't want to ignore the social conditions. If you just stay at the macro, the historical critique of that is you haven't substantiated your claims anywhere, and that's the ongoing critique of solely macro orientations. So where does that leave you? I've given you no answer. Where does that leave you? Here's what I will say. I think part of your question is a so what question. What does this really matter if there's not some kind of connection to social cultural conditions? And in the historical present, it's obvious that we should think about our scholarship in really critical ways. So what I suggest is to, number one, acknowledge that it's difficult. It's difficult to move back and forth between the micro and the macro and attending to those social political conditions, but it's necessary. And what it often leads to is epistemic tensions between your claims of substantiating your work in a micro language and use context, and also your commitments to attending to those broader contextual factors. So that's my non-answer for you have to continue working through it and be okay with it's messy and it's layered. And at times, I know for me, what that often means for me when I present to like a CA audience is that I'm immediately accused of being too ideological in my work. And so thinking about how that's part of my identity. I take up these commitments.